Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon to those of you attending this webinar in Europe. My name is Paul Fenton. I'm the President and CEO of Montrium. We're going to be covering quite a lot of material today, and our topic is using SharePoint 2013 for managing regulated content in the life sciences. So the webinar that we're going to be presenting is intended to be an informative webinar. Hopefully we'll give you a good understanding of how you can use SharePoint for regulated applications, and also give you some insight into how you can go about qualifying SharePoint as well. The slides will be distributed upon request after the webinar. We'll also be recording the webinar and posting a recording of that if you'd like to share this webinar with any of your colleagues. In the GoToWebinar panel, there's a space for you to write questions, and so if you do have questions, feel free to ask those questions in the question panel. And after the webinar, if you have other questions that come up, feel free to tweet me, or you could also send me emails. So with that, let's get started. So our agenda today, we're going to be looking first of all at what is regulated content. So how do we define regulated content? What are the regulatory requirements around the management of regulated content and systems being used to manage regulated content, and how we can use SharePoint for that purpose, and how we need to configure it to meet the requirements of the regulatory authorities. We'll also look at SharePoint governance and SharePoint qualification. We'll think about the different deployment options that are available to us, and then talk about some of the advantages of SharePoint as a platform for regulated content. We'll finish up by discussing some of the approaches that we've taken and also solutions that we've developed for regulated content, and then finally I'll give you some recommendations. So when everybody registered, we asked you a question. So the question was, are you currently using SharePoint in your organization? And it was interesting to see the response. In fact, almost 3/4 of you are using SharePoint in your organization. However, 48% of the respondents were not using it at the moment for regulated content. 25% were, and 13% weren't at the moment, but have plans to use SharePoint within their organization. So we can see that there's actually a quite high SharePoint penetration within the audience, and also that some of you are already using it for regulated content, which of course is very encouraging. Some other information which is interesting. Last year in 2013, there was a survey done on the state of SharePoint in life sciences. And one of the questions was, to what degree are you currently using SharePoint for the following business functions? And there's a whole series of different functions that were listed, and some of them were regulated and some weren't. But we could see that the majority of companies were actually using SharePoint for things like intranet and team sites, project management, and just general document storage and management. And then as we go down, we could see that just over half of the organizations were also using it for regulated content, so things like SOP management or records management. And so there's definitely a penetration of SharePoint in the marketplace for companies that want to use it for regulated content. And today we're going to look at how we can sort of go from having just a standard SharePoint installation or no SharePoint installation to a qualified SharePoint installation that we can use for regulated content management. So some preliminary thoughts to get us going. I think one of the important thoughts that I wanted to bring up was that SharePoint is being used a lot in our industry, and more, in fact, for many different applications. So not just document management, it's being used for many different things. But of course, document or content management is one of the important uses of SharePoint because it has such a rich feature set for that. There's also a perception in the industry that SharePoint can't be used for regulated content. Quite often we hear, well, you can't qualify SharePoint against 21 CFR Part 11. And hopefully today I'm going to be able to show you that that's not necessarily true, that we can qualify SharePoint for 21 CFR Part 11. And also, of course, a quarter of you are already using SharePoint for regulated content. So that's really testimony that it is possible. When we start to think about using SharePoint for regulated content, as with any system, we really need to think about regulatory relevance. So are we using this system for processes or content that is governed by regulation? And then based on that decision, we need to validate or control and control the environment accordingly. So let's think a little bit about what is regulated content. So I've got a very straightforward definition here. Any document, record, evidence or data that's required to be maintained by predicate rule. That's the very straightforward definition. And if you think about that, the types of content that we'd be talking about would be clinical trial documents, evidence of quality. So this is really any documentation or data that you're producing to demonstrate that you're following your procedures and SOPs. It could also be data sets. An example would be preclinical data sets. It could also be clinical data sets, SOPs, training records, electronic submissions. So anything that we've submitted to the regulatory agencies, emails potentially, depending on the content, and batch records. And there are other examples of regulated content, but this is really just to help you understand exactly what we're talking about. Now, what isn't regulated content? Very simply, it would be any document or data that's not required by predicate rule. However, there is a caveat. If we think about this, if we are using a document, even though it's not required by predicate rule to support regulated decisions or traceability, then it may need to be maintained as a record or regulated content. So an example would be, for example, a presentation. If you put together a presentation in which you're making decisions about, say, clinical study design, then potentially we would need to retain that presentation as evidence and documentation of that decision. Another example could be meeting minutes. If you make regulated decisions within that meeting, well, you may need to maintain those meeting minutes in the trial master file or in other master files. An example of a non-regulated content that probably wouldn't ever become a piece of regulated content would be a vacation request form. So with that in mind, I'm going to be asking you several questions throughout this webinar. And the first one I'm going to bring up a poll is, in your organization, how is regulated content currently managed? And so if you could answer when you see the question come up on screen, and then I'll show everybody the results afterwards. I'll give you a few seconds to answer. Okay, so we basically have pretty much everybody's voted, or almost everybody, and the majority of you are still using paper to manage regulated content, which is interesting. So 33% of you are using paper, 12% are using file shares, 24% are using SharePoint and other systems, 24% within another system, and then 9% within SharePoint. So thanks for that. Let's carry on. So let's think now carefully about electronic records. Obviously, if we're dealing with regulated content, we need to also decide whether this is considered an electronic record per 21 CFR Part 11, which will be the primary regulation that we would be using to be able to manage these electronic records or electronic content. And so when we look at 21 CFR Part 11 Scope and Application 2003, it clearly defines what electronic records are. And so there are 4 different types or classifications. The first is records that are required to be maintained under predicate rule requirements and that are maintained in electronic format in place of paper format. So this is really records that only exist in electronic format and are required by predicate rule. The second type are records that are required to be maintained under predicate rules that are maintained in electronic format in addition to paper format and that are relied on to perform regulated activities. So this is really where you've got electronic copies of paper source records that you're consulting to make regulated decisions. The third type is anything that's submitted to FDA under predicate rules. So for example, if you were putting together an EC2D sequence with various different documents for a clinical trial and submitting that to FDA, then those documents as well as the submission would be considered an electronic record and would need to be maintained as such. And then finally, electronic signatures that are executed on electronic records are also considered electronic records in their own right. So if we take those considerations to be able to determine whether a record is 21 CFR Part 11 required or not, we basically need to go through a decision tree. And so let's imagine that we've got a document and we need to first of all ask ourselves, well, does the record exist in electronic format only with no paper source? If the answer to that is yes, then the next question is, well, is it required by predicate rule? Are we required to maintain this document? If it's yes, then straight away we need to consider this as a 21 CFR Part 11 record and that needs to be maintained as such. If we say that, well, it's a record that exists in electronic format with no paper source, however, it's not required by predicate rule, the next thing we need to ask is, well, does it drive regulated processes or decisions even though it's not required by predicate rule? And if it does, then again it becomes a 21 CFR Part 11 record. If the answer to does the record exist in electronic format only with no paper source is no, then we need to ask ourselves, well, is this an electronic copy of a paper record? And if it's yes, then we ask ourselves again, does it drive regulated processes and decisions? And if that's yes, then again that becomes a Part 11 record. So this can be a useful decision tree to use when you're trying to work out what is regulated content versus what isn't, and when we want to hold that content electronically. So let's now think a little bit about electronic records within SharePoint. Different examples of what electronic records could be are, of course, documents. Documents are probably the primary regulated content that we would maintain within SharePoint. And this is the document excluding any descriptive metadata, and documents that are, of course, required to be maintained by predicate rules. Another type of metadata of record could be metadata. So in SharePoint speak, we talk about columns. And metadata would be considered a record if it was being used to perform regulated activities or make regulated decisions. So say, for example, if you were using metadata to be able to track activities within the study, and you were making decisions based on those activities, then that metadata would be considered a record and would need to be maintained as such. Infopath forms, so the form technology used within SharePoint could also be considered a record. Electronic or digital signatures used to sign records that are required by predicate rules. Now, of course, SharePoint doesn't have electronic or digital signatures built in by default, but quite often you would use a third-party system to do that, and if so, you still need to sort of maintain those signatures as records. Audit trails that are generated for electronic records would also be considered electronic records per 21 CFR Part 11. And then any custom applications that are deployed within SharePoint and used for regulated activities or that generate records themselves would also be considered records. So let's think now about the compliance approach. So if we want to use SharePoint for regulated content, we need to make sure that it's compliant. And the way that we do this is we're really thinking about how we can qualify SharePoint against 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. So how we can guarantee that that SharePoint foundation is going to be compliant with Part 11 electronic records. The way we do this is, first of all, we need to identify all of the procedural and technical controls that the system requires to be able to manage records. We then document and verify the configuration of SharePoint and maintain everything under change control and configuration control. And once we've got all of that in place, we then deploy our regulated applications on top. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment on the actual detailed steps of how to get through this. Currently, unless you're introducing a third-party electronic signature solution, 21 CFR Part 11 electronic signatures would be out of scope because SharePoint doesn't have that as a feature natively. So now let's look at the actual individual requirements of 21 CFR Part 11. And so the first one that's applicable, I'm really only talking about the technical controls here and not the procedural. So the first technical control that's applicable is 1110B, which is the ability to generate accurate and complete copies of records in both human readable and electronic form. And basically, SharePoint really only ever, or should only ever, maintain one copy of a record with its version history. And so we can very easily meet this requirement. We can also, of course, open up records very easily from SharePoint into things like Adobe Acrobat Reader. So this is an example of the version history that we have of a particular document. So I can see that I've got 4 different minor versions of this record. And with SharePoint, we can actually go back and open up those previous versions. They're stacked, if you like. And so we can always get an accurate history of exactly what happened to that particular document. The next part of Part 11 that is applicable to SharePoint in terms of technical controls is 1110C, so protection of records to enable their accurate and ready retrieval throughout the records retention period. So of course there are definite procedural controls like backup that need to be put in place, but we also have technical controls available in SharePoint within what we call the Record Center. And notably in the Record Center, we're able to apply retention policies to records to ensure that we can always retrieve them, and we can actually manage the length of time that those records need to be retained. So you can see here in an example of the Record Center that we're able to pull up compliance details for a particular document, and we can see that this particular document, which is a protocol signature page, has been declared a record, and it's been declared a record for 25 years. So in Canada, we actually need to retain records for 25 years. And so I can see that after 25 years, the action that I've decided to implement is to move this document into the recycle bin, so I'll no longer use it. Now, of course, 25 years is a very long time, and it's probably unlikely that I would retain this in SharePoint in my production environment for 25 years. I would probably put it into an archive, and there are definite ways and means of doing that. Some records may have a shorter retention period because of the jurisdiction that they're being created within. So, for example, in the US and in Europe, records typically need to be maintained for 2 years after the last marketing application. And so you could actually apply that here in the same manner. You could also, in terms of action, just generate a notification saying that this record has now reached its retention period, and that you can decide what to do with it. You can either just leave it there, or you could move it into an archive somewhere else, or you could destroy it. That's really up to you. We can also generate the audit log from this particular part of the system as well. 1110D, limiting system access to authorized individuals. So this is a very important part, obviously, of 21 CFR Part 11, making sure that only people have access to what they should see. And SharePoint actually uses Windows authentication, and so there's a single sign-on type functionality. So when I open up SharePoint, I'm automatically going to see that I'm logged on as me, and I'll have certain rights within SharePoint, which have been defined in my security model. And so I'll only see what I'm allowed to see. And if my account's logged, then of course I just won't be able to access SharePoint. So we can control security very well, and also the security model is very granular. 1110E, use of secure computer-generated timestamped audit trails to independently record the date and time of operator entries. Now, SharePoint has an auditing feature that needs to be switched on, and you typically enable this for the various different content types that you want to manage within SharePoint. The audit trail remains linked to the respective records, and this is obviously an important part of 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. We have to make sure that it's always linked. And the way that SharePoint uses audit trails is really to generate Excel reports from the database to be able to show users exactly what's happened on the document. This is obviously a fairly technical export, and it's not very pretty, but it has the information that we need. So this is an example of an export that I've done on one particular record. So I can see that I have a link to the item ID. So this is the link to the record, and this is the internal item ID from SharePoint. I can also see the actual document name. So this is MTM SOP0004.pdf. So I can actually see in more human readable format exactly what record we're talking about. I can see here an entry that was made. So basically Scott McGrail, who's the user, this is the username, made an update to this particular record on the 20th of February 2014, and the update was that they changed, or he changed, the version number. So we actually went from version 1 to version 2 of this particular record, and so we uploaded a new version. This is just one example. There are many other audit trail entries that can be generated, such as who viewed a document. And this can, of course, be important sometimes when we're dealing with content which is very sensitive or blinded. There are also on the market other applications that you can buy to have more sort of user-friendly or easier to read audit trails, but the essential features required by 21 CFR Part 11 are there. So the next requirement, 1110E, is record changes should not obscure previous entries. And again, this is really where the version history comes in. And so we maintain a full version history of content and metadata. And of course, with documents, the changes would actually be within the document themselves. And so we need to be able to go back in time and see previous versions of that particular document or record. And we can do that very easily here by clicking the link to the different versions that we want. And we can also see any changes in metadata. So for example, here for this particular document on the 20th of February, I can see that there were changes. The effective date, for example, was updated, as was the periodic review date. Previously it was the 18th of February, and now it's the 20th of February. So this is also audit trail type functionality that allows us to really understand what's happened to the document. The last three, sorry, this isn't actually the last three, the last requirements, 1110F, use of operational steps to enforce permitted sequences of steps and events. So this typically would be managed in any specific application that you would deploy to SharePoint. So for example, if you were deploying a workflow, there would be a series of events that needed to be managed and sequenced, and that will be done in that application and validated in the application. And so typically we don't qualify for this in the baseline SharePoint qualification. 1110G, use of authority checks to ensure that only authorized individuals can use the system. So this is typically managed through a combination of Active Directory and SharePoint security for the authentication of users and also user rights management. And so we can be very granular, in fact, in the way that we apply authority checks so that individuals who shouldn't be able to use the system can't access, or individuals who shouldn't be able to perform certain actions in the system can't perform them. 1110H, use of device checks. So use of device checks, this is typically managed again by any specific applications that are deployed to SharePoint and wouldn't be handled in the baseline qualification. So this actually is the last requirement. So 1130, this is for open systems. So if you are using SharePoint externally, so outside of your internal organization, so say you're using it with partners or could even be with clinical sites or CROs or CMOs, basically you need to make sure that you have the technical controls for open systems in place as well. And so 1130 says that persons who use open systems to create, modify, maintain, or transmit electronic records shall employ procedures and controls designed to ensure the authenticity, integrity, and as appropriate, the confidentiality of electronic records from the point of their creation to the point of their receipt. And so typically, this means that we need to have encryption. And so this is where we use VPN or SSL or any other encryption techniques which will ensure that as data transits over public networks that we're able to protect it and that it can't be modified in any way or intercepted. We also, of course, use authentication controls as defined in 1110D in conjunction with the encryption. So let's now go back to the qualification of SharePoint. So we know that we have to implement a series of different technical controls and, of course, procedural controls to make sure we can use SharePoint for regulated content. And when we qualify SharePoint, what we really need to focus on is qualifying the baseline features of SharePoint against 21 CFR Part 11. So things like security, things like audit trail, we need to make sure that they're properly implemented and are working correctly. We do this, first of all, by producing a regulatory assessment matrix, which really identifies all of the various different technical and procedural controls that we're going to implement within SharePoint or within SOPs, for example, to be able to manage electronic records per 21 CFR Part 11. And this is a very useful document that you would typically present to an inspector or to an auditor for them to really understand the approach that you've taken and how SharePoint meets the requirements. You would also produce a specification document which really details the SharePoint configuration, so how you go about configuring the various different aspects of the system to meet the regulatory requirements. Once you've done that, you would also execute an installation qualification which would allow you to document all of the different system parameters and exactly how you installed SharePoint, what was the process that you went through, and to also provide clear documentation that SharePoint was installed properly. We then typically would perform a series of operational qualification tests to clearly demonstrate that the configuration has been properly implemented. And so, for example, if we've defined that audit trails need to be generated for all record changes, then we need to go in and do some testing to make sure that that audit trail is being generated properly. Once we've done that, and by no means is that a very large effort, because we're not really talking about that many controls, but we do need to do it. And once we've done that, we can then summarize everything in a report, so very similar to a validation summary report, which will basically provide a clear demonstration that the system meets its intended use and that we can generate and manage electronic records per 21 CFR Part 11 within that system. You can also do the same exercise or integrate within your exercise Annex 11, which is the European equivalent, more or less, of 21 CFR Part 11. Once we've got everything qualified, we of course need to make sure that SharePoint falls under change control and configuration control, and those can be specific procedures or they could be your generic procedures. And then finally, we want to make sure that we have proper governance over the environment to ensure that we can maintain the validated state, and that's where we need a governance plan and also any other relevant SOPs. That's really the approach that we take to get a qualified SharePoint environment so that we can manage regulated content. Another thing that's important when we're thinking about using SharePoint for regulated content is to think about standards. We need to establish a certain number of corporate standards so that if we are managing different types of regulated content from different functional areas or from different activities, that we have some uniformity across the enterprise. And so the first thing that we really need to make sure that we have is clear and formal corporate taxonomies which are aligned with industry standards. And examples of those could, of course, be the TMF reference model, it could be ECTD, it could be CDISC. There are lots of different industry standards, and we should try and leverage them as much as possible so that we can standardize on our terminology and also how we're organizing things. We should also have document classification and records management retention standards and policies. So this is really clearly defining exactly what kind of classification information we want to have on the different types of documents or content that we're creating or managing, and then also what is our retention policy for that content. So how long are we keeping it for? What are we going to do with that content once the retention period is up? We also need to make sure that we have uniform site structures, site templates, content types, and metadata. This is very important to ensure that the SharePoint environment is well managed, that we have clear standards for different types of sites for managing both regulated and non-regulated content, and that if we have content types which are being used across different areas, that we're all using the same content type, that we're not repeating things. All of this is very, very important and is actually also very, very challenging to manage, and so you need to have clear standards in place as well as mechanisms for managing these things. You also need to make sure that you have a security matrix and again security standards for SharePoint, so that when you go and make changes to security, it's done in a very controlled way, and that it's also consistent across various different SharePoint sites. This is also an area which can become very complex and is also very high risk if we're dealing with regulated content which may be very confidential. Then finally, we also need to think about numbering or nomenclature standards. So how are we calling content or files in our system? So thinking about file names and titles and things like that. That also needs to be clearly defined. So you do need to do all of this work up front before you start using SharePoint for regulated content. So I'm going to ask you now to participate again in a poll where we're going to think about formal standards, structures and rules for regulated content, and whether you already have formal structures and all of your various different content tags defined within your organization. So I'm going to bring that up. So if you could tell me, do you have formal standards, structures and rules for regulated content within your organization? So nearly everybody has voted, and it's looking good. 67% of you actually do have formal standards, structures and rules for regulated content, which is great. 29% partially, 3% no, so those guys definitely need to start thinking about putting formal standards in place, and 3% don't know. So that's great. That's an interesting response there. So let's carry on. So the next thing that's very important, once we've got a qualified SharePoint environment in place and we're ready to start to manage regulated content, we also need to think about configuration management and how we actually manage the configuration of our SharePoint environment. And according to GAMP 5, which is a standard that we typically use within our industry for regulated applications, configuration management consists of the following activities. So first of all, configuration identification. So what do we have to keep under control? And then afterwards, configuration control itself. So how do we actually perform that control? Configuration status accounting. So how to document that control. So what documentation do we need to produce? And then finally, configuration evaluation. So how do we verify that the control is in place? So essentially, we need to clearly define the what. So what are we maintaining under configuration control, and how are we going to maintain it? Now within SharePoint, configuration items that we need to be able to control can be divided into 4 different levels. So we've got at the bottom the system level items. So this is really our our servers, our operating system, Active Directory. So really all of the underlying infrastructure that would support SharePoint, be it cloud-based or on-premise. We then have the administrative level, so really the farm level. This is really all of the farm level settings, web application management, and shared services administration. The third level is really at the user level. So this is the site collection level, where we have all of our sites and libraries and content types and metadata and everything else really that we manage at the site collection level. And then finally we have the application level. So this is really your forms, your workflows, or any other third-party applications. And so all of these different things all need to be managed under configuration control. Now, when you're thinking about setting up SharePoint for regulated content, you probably don't want to split your environments. You probably want to have just one farm where you can manage both regulated as well as non-regulated content. And so there's a certain way of going about that. On this diagram, we can see everything in green is basically regulated, and so therefore needs to be managed under change control and configuration control. And then everything else that's orange is non-regulated and therefore doesn't need to go through that same process of change control and configuration control. And so you need to structure your environment as such so that you can at the top level, so at the central admin level, you can really control all of the settings. And then afterwards you can separate out the regulated web applications from the non-regulated web applications. And then below that you would then create all of your site infrastructure. You would also separate out, of course, all of the different databases. And so when you're planning your environment, you really need to define this clearly, how you're going to separate out non-regulated from regulated. The other thing that's important, in addition to the qualification of SharePoint, is the formal procedures. And so we have to have formal procedures to be able to use SharePoint for regulated content or regulated activities. We need to have the procedures also to be able to manage the deployment of the different applications that we want to deploy on top of our qualified SharePoint environment, as well as any third-party applications that we may install as well. And so typically we'll have different SOPs. So we potentially have a SharePoint administration or configuration SOP, configuration management SOP, change control SOP, and then all of the other IT SOPs that we typically have when we need to govern or manage regulated applications, things like disaster recovery, backup, security, etc. So these SOPs need to be in place before you start using SharePoint for regulated content. Another big piece of this is governance. A lot of people have used SharePoint over the years, and it's been a very successful and popular product. But a lot of companies also have not really thought about governance and how to manage that SharePoint environment in the longer term. And so what started out as a really good idea quite often can end in disaster because we have no control over the SharePoint environment. And quite often we get called into organizations who are in that situation, and we need to really almost start again, where we reinstall a farm and then we structure things properly and then migrate the content over. But if you're able to think about governance in advance, you can potentially avoid structural problems or the problem of SharePoint getting out of control. And so the importance of governance is to ensure that SharePoint content organization is standardized across the enterprise. If you're allowing, for example, departments to have their own departmental sites, well, those departmental sites should always have the same kind of structure with the same areas and the same types of content so that we can properly manage that. We need to think carefully about flexibility as well as control when we're defining our SharePoint architecture to make sure that we can accommodate both non-regulated and regulated content. We also need to ensure that we have clear roles and responsibility for the management of the platform, because for sure it's not going to be IT that manages the whole environment. You're typically going to delegate the management of certain aspects of SharePoint to super users or local administrators. There also needs to be proper integration with the change control and configuration control processes. So our governance plan typically will need to cross-reference those processes. And we also need to make sure that we're able to maintain SharePoint in a manageable and validated controlled state. And that really is the ultimate purpose of a governance plan. So an example of a governance plan table of contents, I realized that you can't read everything here, but just to give you an idea of the scope of what we would need to put in place. Typically, we're defining roles and responsibilities, so at the enterprise level as well as at the site collection level, so who does what. There's also the concept of a SharePoint governance board and steering committee to make the important decisions about the SharePoint environment. We then talk about all of the different procedures and policies that we have in place. And they can be within this plan or they can be cross-referenced into other SOPs. We then talk about the various different aspects of information management, so how we organize information within the environment, the site lifecycle management, and then the various different templates that we're going to use to be able to create the various different sites within SharePoint for both regulated and non-regulated content. Finally, we talk about things like taxonomy, security, and application management. And so all of these things are covered in this plan, and basically it's like an SOP. Everybody is trained on it. They follow it to really know exactly what can and can't be done in SharePoint and how to do things to be able to maintain that SharePoint environment. So recently, you've obviously heard a lot about cloud computing. And I think more and more organizations today are thinking about switching to cloud. And SharePoint, of course, can also be deployed on a cloud-based environment. There's no reason why it shouldn't. But when you're doing this, you need to think carefully about it. Now, of course, Microsoft have brought out Windows Azure, which is the Microsoft cloud, and we're able to deploy SharePoint on that cloud. We're also able to deploy it on other sort of large cloud vendors, but there are certain requirements that have to be met. We also have a version of SharePoint Online, so the enterprise version of SharePoint Online, which is part of Office 365, which can also be used if it's properly qualified. And on our website, we have qualification guidelines, which are available for both Windows Azure and Office 365, which you can download if you want to understand more how you go about qualifying those environments to be able to use SharePoint for regulated content. In all cases, whatever cloud type solution you use, you need to make sure that you have the same adequate procedural and technical controls in place as you would for an on-premise installation. You also need to make sure that you perform proper due diligence. So you need to think about how you're going to go and verify that the cloud vendor has all of the controls in place to be able to meet the regulatory requirements, because ultimately you're still responsible. So typically this could be through an audit, or it could be through a review of documentation, a review of certification. There are various different approaches, and again, this is risk-based, so you need to think about what content you're actually managing and the risk that that content poses. Finally, you also still need to qualify the cloud and SharePoint environments unless this was fully managed by the vendor. And I apologize for my slide. It seems to be mixed in with the background there. And so that's a very important thing to do, to qualify and clearly document how both you and the vendor meet the regulatory requirements to be able to use SharePoint for regulated content. So let's now talk a little bit about the advantages of SharePoint as a platform for regulated content. I think the first and foremost advantage is that it's a very versatile and flexible system that can be used across the enterprise for all types of content, both regulated and non-regulated. And it's a collaborative platform, and so it can significantly improve the way that you collaborate on content and that you access content across your enterprise, but also externally as well. It also improves traceability, so it's a lot easier to understand what content we have, who's looked at that content, where it's come from, etc. SharePoint can also be easily qualified to meet the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11 based on the process that I described earlier. And it can also replace many of the ad hoc tools that we use within GXP environments. So today we typically use a lot of trackers in Excel and access databases and things like that. And a lot of these things can actually be replaced by standard SharePoint functionality to be able to manage that content. And of course, the advantage is that everything's centralized in one place. It's properly protected through backup and disaster recovery and everything else. And it's also just one version of the truth. So you're no longer transferring trackers via email and things like that. We can also significantly improve information and knowledge management by having everything in one place and being able to share content with many, many different individuals in one place. And finally, we can also, over time, reduce the total cost of ownership of regulated systems because we're able to consolidate systems together within SharePoint. So I want to talk quickly about what we do here at Montrium in relation to SharePoint qualification and governance and even SharePoint solutions for regulated content. The first thing that we offer is SharePoint validation packs, and we've been providing this now for many years for both the 2010 as well as 2013 and even 2007, but not many people use that nowadays for regulated applications. And this validation pack has really been built to be able to be adapted to any organization that wants to qualify SharePoint against 21 CFR Part 11 or Annex 11. And it typically will shave off probably around 2 or 3 months of work of building these documents for a fairly low cost. It really allows you to properly install and clearly document your SharePoint farm and have that document available or documentation available to be able to present to an auditor or an inspector and clearly demonstrate that you do meet the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11 or Annex 11. That documentation is based on GAMP 5, so all of the document names and even the document content and structure is built based on the GAMP 5 framework, which is the framework we typically use for validation documentation and system documentation within GXP environments. The other thing that we have is our governance plan template pack, which basically provides you with a very comprehensive governance plan as well as a questionnaire that can be answered to be able to complete that plan based on your organization's environment. The plan uses industry best practices on the governance of SharePoint and also integrates all of the regulatory elements as well. In addition to that plan, we can also provide all of the ITS SOP templates that are required as well for 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. Both our SharePoint validation packs and the governance plan, we also provide a lot of services to help clients adapt all of that and get everything in place. And so we've got a lot of experience in doing that, and we've got a team of people that can help. In addition to that, we've got our Montrium Connect solution, which allows us to deploy pre-configured, pre-validated collaborative environments on top of SharePoint for managing content. So our records management is the primary application, which allows us to manage all of the various different regulated content that we would typically come across in life science organizations. And we have around 900 different content types that have been defined for the different areas that you see there. We also have quality management, clinical management, and systems management, which all allows us to manage not only regulated content, but also the processes associated to that. And that is available both on-premise as well as on Azure, and so can be installed in your existing SharePoint environments once they've been qualified, or can be accessed through our cloud. The whole purpose of Montrium Connect is really to facilitate collaboration. So centralizing collaboration in one place and having the various different organizations that need to get involved in your processes and in the generation and use of regulated content all connect in one place. And so here we can see an example where we've got our pharma company that's providing a series of different documents that is also collaborating on certain aspects and certain processes with the various different partners that they work with, so CROs, regulatory authorities, development partners. And those partners also, of course, provide content as well back to the pharma company. So it's one central place where we can all collaborate together. So final recommendations before we finish up. I think first of all, what's important is to clearly identify which regulated content could be managed within SharePoint. So obviously a lot of you, as we heard from the poll earlier, are still managing regulated content on paper. If you're thinking about moving that paper to electronic, you need to think about, okay, well, is this something that we could manage in SharePoint, or is it better suited in another system? You also need to establish an enterprise architecture for your SharePoint environment. So do this up front before you actually install SharePoint. So really think about how are we going to use it, who's going to use it, what are we using it for, and build an architectural model around that. And that model really needs to stand the test of time. So don't think just short term, think also longer term. How am I going to be using this in 5 years' time? Ensure SharePoint is properly qualified. It has to be qualified to manage regulated content. If you're already using SharePoint and for non-regulated content and you want to use it for regulated content, you could potentially retro-qualify it. That's also a possibility. But it definitely needs to be qualified before you put any of that regulated content in there. Ensure that you have a strong governance plan and all of the relevant SOPs, and that everybody's been trained on that plan so they know exactly how SharePoint is being managed and how to perform the various different tasks to maintain that SharePoint environment. You should also leverage SharePoint as an enterprise platform. It's not just a document management system. It actually can do many, many different things and can manage many different types of regulated content. So really treat it as a platform that can be used across the enterprise, and that way you'll definitely get the biggest bang for your buck. And then finally, when you're building this out, it's very important to plan the longer term vision for SharePoint, but also it's important to get it out to users. And so try and implement your SharePoint rollout for regulated content in a step-by-step manner and break it down into very sort of manageable pieces. So my last poll question, so based on everything that you've heard in this webinar, the question is, would you now consider using SharePoint for managing regulated content? So I'm going to bring that up. And if you could answer on screen, that would be great. Okay, so we have just over half of you, so 51% of attendees have said that they would use SharePoint for regulated content, which is good. That means I've done my job. 43% have said that they potentially would. 3% said no, and 3% said don't know. So that's good. Okay, with that, I'm now going to close the webinar. If there are any questions that you have, we have a few spare minutes. Feel free to enter those questions into the question panel, and I'll aim to answer the questions in the last minutes that we have of the call. I already have some questions here, so let me just have a look and see if I can answer those with you. So one question that we have is, how would you qualify the IQ and change controls for companies using the online version of SharePoint? So this is SharePoint Online with Office 365. So what's important is that you need to, first of all, properly qualify the installation of SharePoint Online. So you're going to have to do a certain number of configuration steps, which you would still document in your own IQ. And then afterwards, for change control, and I think that's probably even more important, you're no longer in full control of changes that are being made to the SharePoint Online environment, because obviously Microsoft is making those changes. And that's why there's only a very specific version of SharePoint Online that you can use for regulated content. And this is documented in the guidelines that we have on our website that you can download. But basically, the way that this works is Microsoft will tell you in advance when they're going to make changes and what changes they're going to make. And you typically will have a test environment as well as a production environment. And you need to evaluate those changes to see what the impact would be on your SharePoint deployment, so your SharePoint Online deployment. And then afterwards, you would verify through a change control procedure on your end that those changes don't have a negative impact on the records that you already have in the system. So if you need more information on that, I definitely recommend that you download that guideline from our website, and it gives you very detailed instructions on what you need to do. There are several questions around the presentation itself, and will it be made available to you? My colleagues will send out an email at the end of the webinar to send you a copy of the presentation. Just going to see if I've got any other questions here. So another question we have, you mentioned that Part 1130, so 21 CFR Part 1130 talks about open systems and access to SharePoint from a customer. For example, you mentioned SSL and VPN. Does this need to be qualified separately to SharePoint, or is this part of SharePoint validation? So typically it would be part of SharePoint validation. When you're qualifying a SharePoint environment, you would indicate in the validation documents that SharePoint is considered an open system, and then you would document the controls that you put in place. So if you put in place, for example, SSL, you would document that you're going to implement SSL to ensure encryption, and then afterwards you would verify that that encryption is working properly. So you would verify that the certificate is valid, that you're able to see the site through a HTTPS channel, that you can't see it through just a straight HTTP channel. And most likely you would also implement other technologies to reinforce the security. So for example, you'd probably have reverse proxy, so things like threat management gateway, which can be installed in addition to SharePoint, and which can reinforce the security. And typically you would also qualify that as well to make sure it's been installed properly. One last question, does Montrium offer validation services and consulting along with the validation and governance plan template documents? Yes, we do, and typically we recommend that you work with us to get those things in place. It can be quite complex and requires not only technical knowledge but also regulatory knowledge, and we bring both of those things to the table. And so the vast majority of clients who use our templates also use our services with those templates. Okay, one last question, and then we'll finish up. So what application have you used for digital signatures? We currently use Cosign, so ARX Cosign as a digital signature application, and we also have a validation pack for that. So we get involved in qualifying that both within SharePoint and outside of SharePoint for clients who want to use regulated applications. And then for workflows, we use Nintex as a system, which we also qualify in terms of installation, and then typically we'll also validate the various different steps that we use within Nintex within the applications that we're deploying. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being such a good audience. There was a very high attendance and lots of good questions at the end. As I said, my colleagues will be making the slides available to you, as well as a recording of this session so that you can share that with your colleagues. We'll also be organizing some further webinars in the coming weeks, and my colleagues will also be communicating on that with you. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you on the next webinars. Goodbye. Making the slides available to you, as well as a recording of this session so that you can share that with your colleagues. We'll also be organizing some further webinars in the coming weeks, and my colleagues will also be communicating on that with you. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you on the next webinars. Goodbye.